Good afternoon to everyone. Ladies and gentlemen, let me proudly welcome you to our conference, which is called Voice Beyond Borders, and it's organized by 15 expatriate initiatives, which are also organizations and members of the new Diaspora. First of all, I would like to mention Krakovská kaviareň and also the others, namely Inšpirujme Slovensko in Ireland, Pražská kaviareň, Od Tatier k Šumanu in Belgium, Brňanská kaviareň, Slovak Women in Power, Srdcom doma, the webpage krajan.sk, Parížská kaviareň, Slovaks in Luxembourg, Londýnska kaviareň, Amsterdamská kaviareň, Berlínská kaviareň, Slovak Danish Network, and last but not least, also Slovak Pro. So here I wanted to mention the organizers of today's online conference, Voice Beyond Borders. And now let me tell you why we are actually organizing this event, which is definitely crucial for Slovaks who live abroad, not only in the European countries, but worldwide. It's true that recently a legislative initiative has emerged in Slovakia, and this initiative actually aims at restricting or even abolishing the right for postal voting for Slovaks. In the end, if it works and if this law will be passed by the national parliament in Slovakia, Slovak citizens would practically lose their right to vote. So now it's the question what we want to do with this. And the new Diaspora decided to organize this conference to bring international experience, legal expertise, and also knowledge from different countries. As you will see later, we have very interesting speakers here, not only from Slovakia or Czech Republic, but also from European countries or even outside Europe. So as the next step, please also let me tell you, we have some important information for you, and you might want to ask our distinguished guests here. So please feel free to post your question in the chat on this YouTube channel. And later, we will obviously pose your question to the speakers. We'll try to do our best, and maybe we will ask directly with your question and address to the speaker. Or if we don't have more time, then we would allow the speakers to answer your question after this event. Our conference is split to three panels. The first one is called Why Citizens Abroad Should Be Allowed to Vote. And just maybe to bring more insights on this issue, our speakers, we have two speakers, two distinguished guests for the first panel, Mr. Andrzej Zoll and Ms. Emma de Souza. And we will discuss here why democratic systems link voting rights to citizenship rather than permanent residence, and also why citizens living abroad are not treated as politically disconnected. So, as I mentioned, now I would like to give the floor to Mr. Andrzej Zoll, who will present the topic, and also his presentation is about the principle of proportionality in Poland. I would like also maybe give some introduction about Professor Andrzej Zoll, who is from the Faculty of Law at the Jagiellonian University in Krakow in Poland. In the past, he served as the vice chairman of the State Electoral Commission during the first democratic elections in Poland, 1989, as you know, later as chairman of this commission, and subsequently served as president of the Constitutional Tribunal and as the ombudsman. I would like to mention also here that Mr. Andrzej Zoll will have a presentation in Polish, but English subtitles will appear during his speech. So no worries if you don't understand Polish, you will have a chance to understand what he will be saying when you see subtitles on the screen. So I would like to give the floor to Mr. Andrzej Zoll. Dzień dobry, Mr. Zoll, and floor is yours.
Dziękuję bardzo. Witam wszystkich. Przedmiotem mojej wypowiedzi są problemy z prawem wyborczym określającym status osób głosujących poza granicami tego państwa, w którym przeprowadzone są wybory. Trzeba sobie zdawać sprawę, że jakakolwiek ocena systemu wyborczego musi być oparta na znajomości sytuacji politycznej, relacji pomiędzy blokami politycznymi, stopnia integracji diaspory ze społecznością zamieszkałą na terenie państwa, w którym przeprowadzone są wybory. Przy prezentacji problemów wyborczych związanych z określonym państwem musi się uwzględnić, że prawo wyborcze jest zależne od tego, w jakim stopniu ma ono służyć możliwie dobrze obywatelom w utrwalaniu zasad potrzebnych do wzmocnienia systemu demokratycznego, a w jakim stopniu ma służyć umacnianiu władzy sił politycznych decydujących w danym czasie o stanowieniu prawa wyborczego. Odnoszę się do tych zagadnień z perspektywy polskiego stanu prawnego. Obecnie obowiązuje ustawa z 5 stycznia 2011 roku, Kodeks Wyborczy. Ten akt prawny był w czasie swojego obowiązywania, obowiązuje do dzisiaj, kilkakrotnie nowelizowany, także w zakresie obejmującym przedmiot mojej wypowiedzi. Zanim przejdę do problemów szczegółowych, to chcę przedstawić problem fundamentalny, sprowadzający się do odpowiedzi na pytanie, czy osoby mieszkające za granicą powinny być uprawnione do uczestniczenia w wyborach przeprowadzanych w państwie, którego są obywatelami. Odpowiedzi mogą być na to pytanie różne. Można uznawać, tak jak przyjęto w Niemczech, że mogą brać udział w wyborach obywatele Niemiec mieszkający za granicą, jeżeli płacą podatki w Niemczech. Można uznać, że osoby mieszkające za granicą nie powinny rozstrzygać o problemach społecznych, politycznych, gospodarczych w państwie, którego są wprawdzie obywatelami, ale nie uczestniczą w codziennym życiu danego społeczeństwa. Możliwe są różne warianty takiej odpowiedzi. Na przykład do zaakceptowania jest rozwiązanie dopuszczające do udziału w głosowaniu za granicą osób, które zamieszkują poza ojczystym krajem nie dłużej niż na przykład rok. Można oczywiście określić inny okres zamieszkiwania. Można w końcu przyjąć, że osoby mające obywatelstwo państwa, w którym odbywają się wybory, mieszkające poza jego granicami, są uprawnione do uczestniczenia w wyborach. Taka odpowiedź na postawione wyżej pytanie może zależeć od różnych aspektów. Rozstrzygający może być aspekt narodowościowy. W wyborach do Parlamentu, Sejmu i Senatu przeprowadzonych w Polsce 4 czerwca 1989 roku, a więc w pierwszych wyborach decydujących o polskiej transformacji, było niezwykle ważne dopuszczenie do wyborów obywateli polskich przebywających za granicą ze względów politycznych. Takie osoby przebywały wtedy w różnych państwach, najczęściej w Stanach Zjednoczonych, Wielkiej Brytanii, a także Australii, w krajach Ameryki Południowej. Były to także osoby, które nie miały polskich paszportów, gdyż pozostawały za granicą od zakończenia II wojny światowej. Nie przyjmowały jednak obcego obywatelstwa i czuły się przynależnymi do narodu polskiego. Takie osoby zostały uznane za uprawnione do udziału w wyborach. Rozstrzygnięcie to było przyjęte w 2 aktach wyborczych, wyborach parlamentarnych, jak mówiłem, w 1989 roku i wyborach prezydenckich w 1990 roku. W późniejszych wyborach osobami uprawnionymi były i są teraz tylko osoby posiadające ważny paszport stwierdzający polskie obywatelstwo. Od czynnika politycznego może zależeć ułatwianie albo brak ułatwiania w udziale w wyborach przeprowadzanych za granicą. Można wprowadzać ułatwienie w postaci dopuszczenia obok wyborów osobistych wyborów korespondencyjnych, ułatwiających, szczególnie za granicą, udział w wyborach albo zwiększenie liczby komisji wyborczych na terenach zamieszkałych przez większą liczbę obywateli danego państwa. Utrudnienie udziału może polegać na wyłączeniu możliwości korespondencyjnego udziału w wyborach albo zmniejszaniu ilości komisji wyborczych, na przykład tylko do siedzib placówek dyplomatycznych. We wszystkich wyborach parlamentarnych i wyborach prezydenta Rzeczypospolitej Polskiej przeprowadzanych w Polsce od 1989 roku polscy obywatele mieszkający za granicą mieli możliwość uczestniczenia w wyborach. Były to osoby zamieszkałe w 92 państwach, tak było w wyborach w 1989 roku, albo w 106 państwach, tak było w wyborach z 2023 roku. Z uznaniem prawa obywateli mieszkających za granicą do udziału w wyborach konieczne jest rozwiązanie problemu, jak uwzględnić oddane przez nich głosy w wyborach parlamentarnych w poszczególnych okręgach wyborczych. Problem ten nie zachodzi oczywiście w wyborach prezydenckich. W Polsce nie jest on rozwiązany w sposób zadowalający. Wszystkie oddane głosy za granicą są zaliczane do okręgu wyborczego Warszawa-Śródmieście. Ponieważ tych głosów we wszystkich dotychczasowych wyborach parlamentarnych było zawsze kilkaset tysięcy, to wynik wyborów w tym okręgu nie jest zgodny z rzeczywistym stanem oddanych głosów przez obywateli uprawnionych do głosowania. Nie opracowano dotychczas sposobu rozwiązania tego problemu. Wydaje się, że byłoby słuszne utworzenie osobnego okręgu wyborczego obejmującego głosy wszystkich obywateli biorących udział w wyborach za granicą. W dotychczasowych wyborach, tak parlamentarnych, jak i prezydenckich, różnie rozwiązywano w Polsce dopuszczenie do głosowania korespondencyjnego. Przede wszystkim należy podkreślić, że w Polsce dopiero w kodeksie wyborczym z 5 stycznia 2001 roku wprowadzono możliwość głosowania korespondencyjnego, zarówno przez osoby głosujące w kraju, jak i za granicą. Wprowadzona przez kodeks wyborczy możliwość korespondencyjnego głosowania została zbadana z punktu widzenia zgodności z konstytucją przez Trybunał Konstytucyjny. Trybunał uznał ten sposób głosowania za zgodny z konstytucją, podkreślając wzmocnienie zasady powszechności wyborów. Pierwsze takie wybory odbyły się w październiku 2011 roku. Poza granicami Polski około 17 000 wyborców skorzystało z tej formy oddania głosu. W Polsce ta liczba była wyraźnie mniejsza. W nowelizacji kodeksu wyborczego ustawą z dnia 11 stycznia 2018 roku możliwość głosowania korespondencyjnego została ograniczona do osób niepełnosprawnych i osób, które ukończyły 60 lat, a całkowicie została wyłączona w wyborach poza granicami Polski. Uzasadnieniem miało być niebezpieczeństwo nadużyć w postępowaniu wyborczym w formie korespondencyjnej i osób niepełnosprawnych. Wybory w formie korespondencyjnej zostały wprowadzone z powrotem w 2020 roku jako alternatywa w stosunku do wyborów tradycyjnych, zarówno w kraju, jak i za granicą. Zmiana ta została wymuszona nadzwyczajną sytuacją spowodowaną pandemią. W wyborach parlamentarnych w 2023 roku i prezydenckich w 2025 przywrócono do stanu prawnego wprowadzonego w 2018 roku, czyli wykluczono wybory za granicą w formie korespondencyjnej. Możliwość głosowania w formie korespondencyjnej jest niewątpliwie korzystna dla osób posiadających prawo wybierania. Ułatwia bowiem oddanie głosu, w szczególności osobom niepełnosprawnym lub w podeszłym wieku. W stosunku do osób uprawnionych do głosowania za granicą, głosowanie korespondencyjne w wielu wypadkach w ogóle umożliwia ze względu na odległość zamieszkania od miejsca głosowania wzięcie udziału w wyborach. Odebranie takiej możliwości, jak stało się obecnie w Polsce, stanowi naruszenie zasady równości prawa do uczestniczenia w wyborach. Dziękuję.
Unfortunately, I don't speak any Polish, Mr. Professor, but at least I can say, because I'm not so far away from your home country. Dziękuję bardzo, panie profesorze. I would like to highlight here that it's really our big pleasure that someone like you joined our conference, someone who served as the president of the Constitutional Tribunal of Rzeczpospolita and also ombudsman in Poland. So thanks a lot for your input on this topic. And we'll be very happy to discuss with you further and also maybe reflect the questions from our participants later. But now I would like to slowly move on to our next distinguished guest. And I would like to present now very shortly, very briefly, the second speaker, who is Miss Emma de Souza. And she's going to have a presentation and thoughts on the topic to be confirmed, because the topic itself is topic to be confirmed. So we are very happy to see Miss Emma de Souza, and maybe just very short introduction about you. Emma de Souza is an award-winning campaigner, journalist, and peace activist who changed UK law in a landmark human rights case relating to the Good Friday Agreement. She's the founder and co-facilitator of deliberative democracy platform called Civic Initiative, director of the Northern Ireland Emerging Leaders Program at the National Committee on American Foreign Policy, and a global advisor on peace processes and civic innovation. I hope this was the right information. Otherwise, please feel free to correct me, Ms. de Souza. And now, what to say? Floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the warm introduction, and fantastic to follow the professor's role just before me there. I'm going to pick up a little bit on some of the challenges that we're facing in terms of democratic resilience and legitimacy. Voter apathy, disinformation, and disenfranchisement is weakening our democratic institutions and our democratic values. It is not enough to simply tell people to use their vote. We have to tell people why they need to use their vote and remove barriers to participation. Though turnout is not unique to countries like Ireland and the UK, I'm in Northern Ireland, so I get to sit between the two of them. It's a global problem, and it is one that does not rest purely on the shoulders of citizens. Voter apathy is, frankly, a failure of the political system to demonstrate its value. Low voter turnout raises a valid question regarding legitimacy. If only 40% of the electorate vote, how strong can we really say the mandate is for those who win? The challenges to participation are multi-pronged. In Ireland, we have one of the most restrictive voting systems in Europe. Young people under the age of 18, overseas voters, and the diaspora are all denied the right to vote. Postal ballots are extremely limited, and modern participatory measures such as advance voting simply do not exist. Over 125 countries and territories enfranchise their citizens outside of the state, but Ireland is not one of them. I am an Irish citizen who lives in Northern Ireland. I'm on the island of Ireland, but I'm technically under the jurisdiction of the United Kingdom. I'm therefore denied the right to vote for my president due to Ireland's restrictive presidential voting rights. To renew democratic legitimacy, we have to consider who counts and challenge the perception of voting not as a chore or a task, but as something that is a civic right and a civic duty. One tool for strengthening democratic participation is lowering the voting age to 16. Young people have to live with the decisions of policymakers for the longest, and yet often they are excluded from the voting system. There does exist a robust body of evidence that demonstrates a direct link between voting at 16 and forming a lifelong voting habit, which in turn can boost voter overall turnout. Detractors may point to the generally low levels of turnout between 18 to 24-year-olds, but evidence does suggest that a 16-year-old is more likely to vote than their 18-year-old counterparts, as recently seen in Scotland's elections. And the reason for that can actually make quite a lot of sense. When you're 18, many young people are going through a period of extreme flux. They may be going to university for the first time. They may often be leaving the family home for the first time, going out and starting a job or a career for the first time. A 16-year-old is more likely to be in the family home, more likely to be surrounded by a support system that can encourage that young person to participate in the democratic system. When looking at wider barriers to participation, we don't have to reinvent the wheel to find solutions to increase democratic resilience and strengthen legitimacy. Across Europe, several countries have brought forward measures and mechanisms that do make it easier for citizens to participate in democratic processes. For example, in Estonia since 2005, there has existed internet voting. In Denmark, Sweden, Latvia, Finland, and other countries, there is a system of advance voting. So rather than in Ireland, where you can only vote on one day, where several people may not be able to have that day off work or simply cannot get to the voting station to be able to vote, you then instead have several days in advance of the election to be able to cast your ballot. It is demonstrably clear that increasing the time frame for voting simply will help more people to be able to take part in the voting process. Universal posting rights exist in several countries. Automatic enrollment is another measure for removing a barrier to participation. All of these mechanisms are designed to strengthen the participation of citizens in their democratic right to be part of the system. What is missing is simply the institutional and the political will to be able to look at our counterparts across Europe and take a more joined-up approach. If we really want to strengthen democracy, increase legitimacy, and include more citizens in a democratic process, we have to ask the question of who counts. And we have to look to our European partners for best case examples and modern techniques to increase their participation, because the answers for all those questions already exist. We just have to work together to deliver them. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, also Emma, for your contribution. And thanks a lot, because it was very insightful opinion for this topic, and also for the public debate in my home country. I remember there were also some questions from chat. We have also on this YouTube live stream. But let me also maybe ask you, because as you mentioned, normally it goes the way that we want to allow the citizens in European countries, for instance, to give them actually these rights to vote, even if they live abroad. But do you know any European countries, or even worldwide, they would have restricted actually the postal voting rights recently? Is there any country which could be maybe used also for legislators in Slovakia, and they could say, but look here, there are also countries, they actually follow the legislation we are proposing in Slovakia? I don't know if my question was enough clear, but
yeah, I think,
yeah,
well, there are some countries that do offer universal posting rights, and there isn't evidence to suggest that this is something that's misused. Often we see in debates around extending voting rights or extending the rights to citizens outside the state, there is a misperception that it's going to be misused, but there's no evidence to suggest this is actually the case. Countries that offer universal postal rights would be Finland, for example, has a pretty good system for that. So that would be one country that I would look at as an example. And I believe Denmark maybe also has something similar. But the idea that postal rights, like postal voting, is going to do anything other than strengthen participation, it's not backed up by any serious evidence.
So we could also say, in other words, that actually in Slovakia, if they restrict, because in this law amendment, in this proposal by legislator, by government in Slovakia, is mentioned, and it's still discussed and not decided, because it goes to the first voting now in the parliament, and afterwards to the second one, and also depends on the signature by the president of the republic. But in any case, they are saying now that they would allow the citizens that they could vote at embassies. But then the question is that we have countries like, for instance, I don't know, in South of America, we have very few embassies. And for a lot of people, it would mean that they would have to travel, and basically their participation in the elections would be restricted. So do you agree with this stance, if you are saying that even if you allow the citizens to vote at embassies, it is not enough, and it would restrict actually their rights?
It's still a barrier to participation, and it will limit the ability of some citizens to be able to cast their ballot. It could be described as a polling tax, because the reality is, if citizens have to travel to an embassy, they might have to take a day off work, they might have to pay for transport costs. There are all these additional costs that could be accounted for if they have to actually travel out of their way to go to an embassy. So it could be described as a barrier to participation, and B, as a polling tax, because that citizen is going to face an additional financial burden to be able to actually take part in the democratic process. So it is not as good as being able to offer universal postal voting rights.
And Ms. De Souza, maybe let me ask you something else. I see that we still have a bit time before we move to the third speaker at our conference. And I'm also quite wondering, because to be honest, also I'm facing very often when I talk with the people, especially those who live in Slovakia, why we should vote abroad if you don't pay, for instance, taxes, and these kind of questions that we don't have a direct link to the country. And also, I need to say that I'm also a person who have been living in another country beyond Slovakia for quite a long time, for 1 decade. And a lot of people are asking Slovakia why we should have a right if you don't pay, if you don't live there, actually. So what would be your answer to this kind of opinion?
Yeah, look, it's something that we hear a lot in Ireland as well. I've encountered this particular argument several times in debates that I've taken part into. And the reality is several things. One, a citizen does not simply lose their attachment to their home place when they leave, right? So being able to maintain a right to vote is maintaining a connection to your home country. And it's very important for several reasons. One, because eventually, of course, we want people to return home, right? We want them to come back. And maintaining that kind of connection, that kind of civic duty, is a very important component of doing that. Secondly, a lot of citizens that do actually leave their home countries, they often don't necessarily do it by choice. In the context of Ireland, several, citizens have had to leave for several reasons, but economic crisis, the lack of housing, the lack of opportunities, often forces our young people to have to actually immigrate. And eventually we want them to come back. So this is an important component of that. And of course, citizens who live outside the state are impacted by the policies and decisions being taken in their home countries. Whatever policies are being set can often impact whether or not a person might return home. And in addition to that, there is, of course, the fact that several people that live in countries, might not necessarily pay taxes, but of course do have the right to vote. No country actually attaches the right to vote to taxation for good reason. That's not democracy.
Thanks a lot. Thanks a lot. It was really insightful, as I mentioned, and we'll be more than happy also to discuss with you and to get an answer from participants of this conference today. Thanks a lot once again.
Thank you so much.
And now I will maybe slowly move to our third speaker. But before we start with the third one, let me also mention, as it was already mentioned in the beginning of this conference, that we have now it's right time for the second panel, which is called External Voting Abroad, Models, Security and Accessibility. In the second panel, we will present the electoral models in European countries, how postal voting works in democratic states, how security concerns are addressed, and why postal voting is considered as a standard solution, including for citizens who live abroad. So now, please let me introduce very slowly our next speaker, who is Mr. Peter Spáč. And I don't know if you can see right now.
I can see. Thank you very
now
much.
I can see. Hello, good afternoon, Mr. Spáč. And just let me also say very short.
Yep.
Just let me say very short presentation about you. Mr. Spáč is Associate Professor from Masaryk University in Brno in Czech Republic. He currently serves as an Associate Professor and Vice Head of the International Institute of Political Science at the Faculty of Social Studies at Masaryk University, where his research focuses specifically on elections. So he's really the right person to talk about this topic. And his presentation will be about voting by mail in the Czech Republic. So welcome once again, Mr. Spáč, and floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much once again for inviting me. So before I start, let me just say a few words about the postal voting in general. So how we understand postal voting, basically it's about extension of people who we want to add as electorate. And Slovakia is a case of a country which has a lot of people who are living abroad because they are studying, working, or they just happen to be abroad during the time of elections. So it has quite a lot of interest to include these people into elections and to just keep the link between them and the country. And I would like to talk about Czech Republic, as you announced, and it's just a coincidence, but Czech Republic for a long time period had no postal voting, unlike Slovakia. But this recently changed in 2024. Czech Parliament adopted a new measure which launched postal voting. So since 2025 general elections, which already happened last year, Czech voters who are abroad can use this postal voting mechanism. And basically, the Czech government, the previous one, basically it pledged or it fulfilled what Slovak government has pledged, because Slovak government has a manifesto which pledges that it aims to extend postal voting to also presidential elections, but now we see that there is some sort of different procedure, which is right now from the beginning. It's in the parliament right now. So how it works in Czech Republic right now? So Czech Republic is also a country which has quite a lot of people living abroad, but not so many as Slovakia, of course. But still, if you are a Czech citizen who is living abroad for various reasons, you have an opportunity to use postal voting for the most important elections. These are the elections to lower chamber, or the most important parliamentary elections in the country, then for presidential elections and for European elections. And the way how it's done it's basically very convenient for the voters. So Czech Republic also has many embassies in the world. So there is a linkage between these embassies and the people who are living in foreign countries. So to vote and to use postal voting, you have to be enrolled into some so-called special voter register, which is very easy to do. You can just apply for this anytime. There are no limits basically when you can do this. There's only one deadline. You have to do this at least 40 days before the next election. So when you are in this register, you are there more or less forever. And when you are in this register, which costs you almost nothing, you just have to apply for it. You can use electronic devices, you can use post, you can do this in person on embassy. So there are various ways. When you are in this register, then you are allowed to apply for postal voting. So there are some deadlines you have to of course fulfill. So using these various channels, you can use post, you can use in-person contact on embassy, you can use electronic ways. You apply for postal voting, and then the embassy will send you guidelines how to vote using this postal voting. They will not send you the ballots actually, which might be a waste of paper, but they will send you guidelines how to do this. So you go to a website where you download all those ballots. You pick the one you want to vote for, typically the party you want to vote for. You can assign some preferential votes for the candidates if you want. If you don't want, you don't need to. And then you just place this ballot into envelope number 1. I can call it an inner envelope. And this envelope contains only this ballot you choose, so the party you want to vote for. And this inner envelope you place in a second envelope, which we can call an outer envelope, together with a signed small paper that it's you. And then these two envelopes are sent back to the embassies, where a committee, which can consist of members of all the political parties, as it's done in Czech Republic in mainstream elections, right, in the voting stations in the country, then it calculates the vote. So there is quite a strict security how to maintain fair and free elections in this regard, because there is no way how you can assign voter to the vote the voter has given, because all what is public basically is the name of the voter that the voter turned out to the election, so that the voter placed the vote. But nobody knows, of course, which voters voted for which parties. So this is a security measure that it's very difficult to somehow avoid. And for the first time, this has been used in 2025 general elections last year in autumn. And we saw that there was an increase in number of foreign voters. For previous rounds of elections in 2021, 17, or 13, we can go in this sort of history. Roughly 10,000 votes came from abroad, and these were all votes which had to be done on embassies. Right now, in the most recent elections, 25, when the postal voting was allowed, this number of foreign votes has increased, and it's more than doubled. So even now, it makes around 0.5% of all the votes, so it's not a large number. But we have to take into account that Czech Republic, in comparison to Slovakia, has relatively lower numbers of people who are living abroad. So when Slovakia is now discussing whether to cut this postal voting, and we have to say that this is not a change, which is a discussion about the change. A change is, if, for instance, if you reduce the taxes from 21 to 20%, but a change where you have postal voting or non-postal voting, that's not a change. It's definitely more than a change. So we can really say that allowing postal voting, at least in the Czech context, has increased the number of people who could effectively use their voting right, and which would not do it in case only embassies would be the only opportunity how to vote. So we can expect, now we don't know, because Slovakia is right now discussing this issue. We don't know what will be the final solution. But in case the postal voting will be cut, we can really predict that a substantial number of people who are either studying abroad or working abroad, or they will just happen to be there in a different country in the time of elections, they will lose effective way how to execute their voting right, because they will not be either able or not be willing to just travel 50, 100, 200,000 kilometers to the next voting station. So this is the story of Czech Republic. I hope that I gave some basic outline, and thank you very much.
Thanks a lot. Also to you, Mr. Spach. It was very interesting, actually, and I think we could use also the example from the Czech Republic because it's a neighboring country. Let's say we have the closest ties between Czechia and Slovakia. But I'm still wondering if I can please ask, and maybe this kind of question was also in our chat, that how do you consider also like the fact with the security of voting? Because this is very often criticized. And I also remember, and we'll have also another speaker from the States, from the United States of America, that we have always this long story and also last US elections that somehow actually the votes could be abused. And because you also mentioned envelope, and also you need to register at embassy, as you mentioned. So do you think that there is also risk, security risk in this kind of situation? And maybe could you explain how in the Czech Republic you can guarantee, make safeguards like for the election process?
Okay, let me just say that. Sorry, I hear my echo. I hope it's not okay. So the security issue, of course, is important, but the thing is that unless you just put a camera behind every voter's back, there is always a risk of some breach of the rules. Even the voting behind those cabins. So when voters within the borders of the country, those millions of voters, when they vote, there is always a risk of some breach of the rules, because somebody can instruct them to vote for some party and to give them some proof, making a picture of some ballot, placing in an envelope. There is no way how you can avoid that. There is absolutely zero chance of breach of any sort of rules. Of course, postal voting is different from normal voting, because postal voting is a response to existence of people who are either not able or who are not willing to come to the country of where the elections are taking place. And you, of course, have to adjust the rules. It's very similar to some different segments of society. For instance, disabled people also are not able to vote in a classical way. So we assign an assistant to them who will help them. And of course, there is also no 100% guarantee that the assistant will also just do not follow their rules. The assistant will just vote for some different party. The same counts for people who are not able to get to the voting stations. So we send mobile boxes. And also there is a different way how to treat those elections. So postal voting, of course, is a response to reality that many people are just abroad. And of course, we can expect that some of these people will try to avoid the rules. But just because this exists, and this risk exists in any types of elections, even in those classic ways, just because of this, we will not abandon the elections, because we can't just think that everybody or all the voters are potential criminals. So there are security measures, of course, which are the maximum we can do. So the double envelope system is one of them. And we just have to treat people as adults. So we have voters who are adults, and adultery means that you have some sort of responsibility to yourself, to other people, and to your country. So I heard those stories that there is some abuse and suspicions and accusations how this postal voting has been mistreated. I have seen no evidence. And after 20 years, Slovakia has been using this system. I would really like to see at least one evidence, one story of somebody breaching the rules, because this really doesn't align with the second story, which is very many times often told, is that we have people who are 20, 30 years living abroad from Slovakia. Now they will try to misuse the elections. Well, on one hand, we say that we have people who are a long time abroad, who have no interest in the country, but also we say that they are so much interested in the country that they are still ready to breach the rules. It's not really the case. So even if there are some people who want to break the rules, they will break them, regardless of the way how we vote. And let's just face the reality. Postal voting means that you have tens of thousands of people at most who are using this device. If even 1 in 1,000 will try to breach the rules, there will be some individuals. In comparison to millions of voters who vote in the home country, it's basically zero. So of course there is a cost, which seems that for some people might be a reason why to ban the postal voting. But for me, my experience with this way, how people use this device, the risk is absolutely zero in comparison to the benefits. And the main benefit is to create a linkage between people abroad and the home country.
It's also actually worth mentioning that we have a very big community, especially of students in the Czech Republic. And it's also worth reminding here that it's not only for Slovaks who live abroad, but also those who can't, for several reasons, actually take part in person in elections. So this is also, and thanks a lot for your contribution. Mr. Spach, we'll be more than happy also to discuss with you questions we might have in our chat. And I would maybe slowly move forward, because our next speaker is Miss Daniela Vintila, with the name of her presentation, Comparative Overview of Electoral Regulations across all EU member states in what refers to voting from abroad. And I would like maybe also to introduce Ms. Daniela Vintila, who is a coordinator of International Migration Research Network and associate professor at the Center for Ethnic and Migration Studies of the Faculty of Social Sciences of the University of Liège. She's also the chair of the standing group Migration and Ethnicity of the European Consortium for Political Research. She holds a PhD in political science from Universidad Autónoma de Madrid. Her interests lie especially in the areas of comparative politics, EU citizenship, international migration, political participation and representation, and social protections policies. So this is from my side. And now finally, I would like to give floor to Ms. Daniela Vintila. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the warm introduction and for the invitation to participate in this debate. Today I was asked to give a very short overview of the electoral regulations applicable across all EU member states regarding voting from abroad. But as you know, I only have 10 minutes, so I decided to focus primarily on 3 key points. First of all, which EU countries grant voting rights for their citizens living abroad? Secondly, which concrete procedures must citizens who live abroad actually follow in order to register as voters for the elections held in their countries of nationality? And thirdly, which are the main voting modalities that are currently used across the EU for citizens living abroad, including postal voting, which I understand is of particular interest to you. So let me first start with the first point: which EU countries allow their citizens to vote from abroad? And the answer to this question actually depends on the type of elections that we are taking into account. So when it comes to subnational elections, meaning local elections or regional elections, it's important to remind ourselves that most EU countries do not actually allow voting from abroad. There are very few exceptions to this. For instance, Latvia, where Latvian citizens can still vote in municipal elections from abroad, but for the rest of the EU member states, usually they do not allow voting from abroad in subnational elections. Now, the situation is very different when it comes to national parliamentary elections or European parliamentary elections, because for these type of electoral contests, almost all EU member states allow their citizens living abroad to vote. And in fact, across the EU, there is only a tiny minority of countries, including Ireland, we discussed it before, but also Malta, Cyprus, and Denmark, that restrict this possibility of citizens abroad to vote for national elections or European Parliament elections to specific categories of individuals living abroad, such as diplomats or civil servants, military personnel, or some categories of posted workers. But for the rest, it's important to highlight that voting in national elections remains quite widespread across the EU. But at the same time, the procedure for voting from abroad still varies quite a bit across EU member states. Which brings me actually to the second point that I wanted to make today: how citizens living abroad can actually register to vote in elections held in their countries of nationality. So in this regard, there are 2 main systems for electoral registration of citizens abroad that are used by EU member states. The first one is a system of automatic registration, which basically means that citizens living abroad are automatically included as voters on the electoral roll, and they can basically cast the ballot without the need of taking any further administrative steps. And across the EU, currently around a quarter of all member states are automatically registering their citizens abroad in the list of voters, including countries such as Finland or Portugal or Estonia, among several others. Now, the rest of EU member states use another system, which is a system of electoral registration that is upon request. What does it mean? It means that citizens abroad must actually proactively apply in advance of the elections to be registered on the list of voters before they can actually cast the ballot. Now, this second system, which is widely used and which requires this prior electoral registration of citizens abroad, has often been criticized as being already a barrier for electoral participation of citizens overseas, because it requires them to invest more time, more effort in registering as voters before being able to actually cast the ballot in elections. And this has become, if we look at the situation across the EU, this has become particularly challenging in countries, for instance, where the deadlines for registration as a voter from abroad are very short. But also it's challenging, especially in countries where the whole administrative process of electoral registration is rather complex, or in countries where this electoral registration is required before every single election, as it is the case, for instance, for Germany, as opposed to other countries such as Belgium, where I'm currently based, that requires this electoral registration only once, because it's then automatically renewed for all the subsequent elections. And moving now to the third point that I wanted to make today, once an individual living abroad is registered as a voter, how can they actually cast the ballot for elections held in their countries of nationality? This is a very important aspect, because even if a state grants voting rights to its citizens abroad, the specific modality, the specific voting method that is made available to them is also very important, because it can either facilitate or hinder the electoral participation of those living abroad. And again, if we look at the situation across the EU, we see that there are several voting modalities that currently exist for out-of-country voting. Sometimes they are using combination, and I'm talking here about in-person voting from abroad, about postal voting, proxy voting, and in some cases even electronic voting. But these last two are less common. So, for instance, proxy voting is currently used only in a handful of EU member states, including Belgium or the Netherlands, whereas electronic voting is even more exceptional. And I think we all know the case of Estonia as a very well-known example for electronic voting. But in turn, the most common, the most frequent voting modalities from abroad remain in-person voting and postal voting across the EU. And sometimes they are also used in combination. So in-person voting, as the speakers before already explained, usually happens at consulates or at embassies abroad. And this in-person voting actually remains the most frequent voting modality that we have for citizens abroad across the EU. However, how well it works or not really depends on the infrastructure that member states implement their diplomatic missions abroad. And oftentimes we see indeed very long queues of voters waiting abroad at a very limited number of consulates that some member states have in other EU countries, which is of course one of the reasons why also offering additional modalities for voting from abroad is so important. And postal voting indeed is one of these additional modalities. It is now fairly widely used across the EU. It is basically available in around 3/4, I would say, of EU member states that allow their citizens living abroad to vote by post. And in some countries, postal voting is not only an option among several others, including the in-person voting at consulates, but it is also the main way in which citizens abroad are participating in elections, as it happens, for instance, with Germans abroad, with Austrians abroad, and so on. And postal voting, I would say, remains quite fairly used across the EU because of its advantages when compared to other voting modalities. It is efficient, it is relatively low cost, a low cost method compared to other voting methods, especially if the postal services are working well. It increases accessibility, it reduces the need to travel to consulates, and as Emma already mentioned before, it can be particularly useful for citizens who live very far away from their diplomatic missions, or for citizens who live in remote areas, in large countries where traveling to consulates is really very time consuming. But you mentioned this before, and it was mentioned in the chat in some of the questions, that postal voting continues to raise certain questions regarding for instance, the risk of ballots being late or being lost due to a more limited reliability of postal services in some countries, but also challenges in terms of verifying the identity of voters, or challenges in terms of ballot secrecy, especially when we are talking about this unsupervised environment. However, the EU countries that are continuing to implement postal voting are doing that by addressing these concerns through the implementation of several mechanisms, several safeguards for identity checks, for declarations of identity, for even tracking the ballot by post. So to try to avoid electoral fraud, or to try to limit as much as possible any issues that could affect the integrity of the electoral process. And there are really many ways, many forms of verification that are applicable to postal voting. For instance, there are forms of verification that are happening when the person actually registers for postal voting. For instance, they can submit their ID or several personal identifiers along with the application form for postal voting. Then there are other forms of verification that are happening when the voter actually receives the electoral material. Once again, they can present their ID in order to receive the ballot and the electoral material. And there are, of course, verifications that are happening at the point at which the vote is cast. For instance, several countries are requiring declarations of identity, copies of voters' identification documents, which are submitted together with the vote for additional voter verification and authentication in separate envelopes, as the previous speaker was mentioning as well. Some other countries are even requiring signature of witnesses. I think it happens in Finland, also in Australia, beyond the EU. And of course, there are many countries that are introducing particular protocols which are specifying the time frame in which voters can post their ballot, and they are also applying, of course, legal penalties in case there are breaches for the secrecy of voting. And then many European countries are also addressing these challenges by implementing several mechanisms of institutional oversight. Take the example of the involvement of consulates and embassies in postal voting. They can really play an important role in distributing, in collecting, in checking the ballots before they are sent to the electoral authorities of the country of origin. So to conclude, I would say that voting from abroad in national elections remains widely recognized across the EU. There are indeed some variations in terms of how citizens abroad can register as voters and how they can actually cast the ballot for specific elections. But when it comes to voting modality, postal voting together with in-person voting remain very common voting modalities. And as I said, several EU member states can introduce several measures to ensure that voting from abroad remains accessible, remains inclusive, but at the same time, it preserves the integrity and the secrecy of the electoral process. Thank you very much. Unfortunately, Norbert, I cannot hear you. I think it's a problem with the microphone.
Unfortunately, I apologize. I was actually muted. So thanks a lot also for your presentation, for your inputs on this very important topic, and also to give us some overview how is the current legislation in different European countries. I think we still have a little time. So if you allow me, I would like to ask you something, because also it comes from the discussion we have had in our chat. And also, as you are expert, we can say in migration. So maybe I would like to ask you, because now we can see recently that more and more people leave their countries, their home countries, and they move abroad. So if we can say that, for instance, with this growing migration, we should also consider actually some formal parliamentary representation for the diaspora as a right, maybe also something that should be enshrined also in the constitution of the country, because maybe I'm not sure, but perhaps in some countries, you might know better than me, there are also parliamentary seats for diaspora, which actually ensures that people, citizens who live abroad, are sufficiently also represented, and they have some access, and they are considered as a part of democratic decision making. So perhaps if you could maybe provide also your thoughts on this kind of question. Thank you.
Absolutely, this is indeed a very interesting point, and there are several countries also across the EU that do have special electoral districts for citizens living abroad in their national parliament, the reserve seats that you mentioned. So I'm talking about the case of Portugal, the case of Italy, the case of France, Romania, Croatia as well, and several studies have already been made regarding these countries that do recognize special representation for the citizens abroad. And they have generally highlighted the fact that there is a higher substantive representation of the interests, of the needs of the diaspora when these special reserve parliamentary seats exist, in the sense in which the matters that really are of strong interest, of importance for citizens abroad, are much more discussed in the national parliament when compared to the other countries where these reserve seats do not exist. In the other countries that do not have reserve seats for the moment, of course, the votes are counted in the electoral districts where the voters abroad are affiliated, which, for instance, based on my research that I did with several political parties in Spain, they were mentioning that the fact that Spain does not have a special electoral district for citizens abroad really matters in terms of how diaspora is addressed and how their interests are addressed in the national domestic political arena. There is less interest from political parties to even campaign abroad, to reach out to citizens abroad, to reflect their demands in the national domestic policy making when there are not these reserve parliamentary seats abroad. Absolutely.
It's also worth mentioning, because now I remember that, for instance, in Hungary is a very large diaspora, especially not even so far away because of the history, especially after World War II or World War I, upon the Treaty of Trianon. And there are several hundred of thousands of Hungarians in neighboring countries. On the other hand, also, for instance, in Hungary, Hungarians living abroad, they can vote also only actually for the nationwide list, because they have also for their electoral counties MPs in the parliament. However, only on the nationwide list Hungarians are allowed to vote. So thanks a lot, Ms. Vintila. It was very comprehensive reply. So we're also very happy that you joined our conference. And maybe this is the right time that we slowly move to the third panel of our conference. And before I introduce our distinguished guests, actually in the third panel, we have three speakers. And the third panel is actually concerned as postal voting, whether it should be abolished or not, what it means in practice. And we will have now representatives of our expatriate organizations from even North America, Denmark, and the Czech Republic. And they will share their views on this topic. So we'll also talk about travel distance and cost, unequal access depending on country and city, and also practical loss of voting rights despite formal citizenship. I think it's enough from my side, and I would like to welcome our fifth speaker actually in a row, Mr. Braňo Vargic, with his topic, elections on the West Coast in the United States. So let me just shortly please also introduce Mr. Vargic. He holds a PhD. He leads the Slovak Pro, one of the participating organizations in this event. And the Slovak Pro chapter is based in Chicago, where he helps connect Slovak professionals, entrepreneurs, students, and friends of Slovakia across the Midwest and even beyond. Slovak Pro is a US-based nonprofit organization dedicated to strengthening the Slovak professional diaspora, building community, and creating meaningful bridges between Slovaks abroad and Slovakia. In addition to his work with Slovak Pro, Braňo teaches also at Grand Valley State University in Grand Rapids in Michigan, and is the founder of Talent Square, a startup focused on modernizing talent acquisition through social media, automation, and performance marketing. So this is just short. I think we could talk much more about Braňo with his success story and a lot of information regarding his professional background. And now I would like to give the floor to Mr. Vargic.
Hello, everybody. Thank you, Norbert. Maybe a little correction or update on the Slovak Pro. Slovak Pro is in North America, so not only United States but Canada as well. We have actually a couple chapters in Canada. One is in Toronto and one is in Vancouver. At the moment, Slovak Pro has a base of roughly about 3,000 members. Or let's put it this way: our database at the moment includes about 3,000 Slovaks living in North America, but growing. So I am a leader, plus together with my partner in crime, Nico Dubovsky, of the Chicago chapter, which is one of the 10 chapters. And each chapter, while kind of works or functions as a semi-independent unit for the local community, whether that's Chicago, Boston, New York, San Diego, Silicon Valley, et cetera. But obviously we are kind of under a umbrella of a organization that's nonprofit, fully registered in the United States. And so, we are heavily involved with the work with the diaspora in North America, with some of the second and third generations interest group, if you will. Obviously, we do a lot of work together with our honorary consuls in the United States. There are 14 of them. So there's a lot of things, a lot of stuff that we do in terms of diaspora. Look, I will be very pragmatic and very straightforward, and actually probably very short from the practical point of view of what would the change of the current postal voting mean. It comes down to time, money, and capacities. At the moment in the United States, there's about 65,000 post offices or places where you can cast a envelope, where you can cast your vote. If I use a little bit of an extrapolation and a little bit of a generalization, this number 65,000 plus means that within an hour, maybe within an hour and a half max, but those might be rather edge cases. Anybody who is at the moment with the current system willing and wanting to cast a vote to Slovak parliamentary elections, it will probably take him an hour and a half of the time, potentially waiting in line at the post office for a few minutes to drop it. Actually, I was in the last elections. I was one of the 60,000 plus people that voted from abroad. And that's exactly what happened. Went down to the post office. Obviously, there were some steps that I had to do prior to that in order to get the right ballots that were mailed to me, and in order to register at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs. If I remember correctly, the ballots arrived. I filled out the ballots, cast a vote by going to the post office. If that process, if you will, is changed to what is proposed right now, and especially if it's changed to the point of only being able to take part in the parliamentary election at the Slovak embassy. Slovak embassy is in Washington, D.C., which is on the East Coast. So let's just take as an example, just to take it a little bit to the extreme, take the example of a San Diego, so California, or one of our strongest chapters with probably one of the biggest membership bases in Silicon Valley, in San Francisco area. In order for someone who would be now asked to go to the Slovak embassy in DC, that means that this person would have to take a flight. The flight, just to get the scale of the country size, the flight from San Francisco to Washington, D.C. is approximately the same flight as Vienna, Dubai. So about 5.5 to 6 hours. Average price of a plane ticket alone, well, with the current drastically increasing prices of fuel, we can count anywhere between $600 to $800 round trip, depending on how far in advance or how short in advance you are purchasing that ticket. So that alone is one major cost consideration. Number two, obviously, because it's such a distance, you would probably have to spend the night, at least one night in DC, in order to be able to, I'm assuming, participate at the embassy with casting of the votes that will be within the working hours. So that's another $200 to $300 as a price for hotel. And on the top of it, one thing that needs to really be put into perspective is in the United States. Again, a little bit of a generalization because that depends from employer to employer. But overall, the amount of holiday or vacation time that a average business in the U.S. provides to its employees is 2 to maximum 3 weeks. In other words, 10 to 15 working days. I'm assuming that the current proposal takes into consideration that the election date at the embassy would be a work day, so Monday through Friday. And, that would, again, mean that somebody traveling such a distance to go cast a vote, would probably have to take at least 1, 2, in some cases, maybe even 3 days, of vacation time, which, given the context of 10 to 15 days would represent a relatively significant amount of vacation time. And so, these three elements alone are definitely something that if the current debate goes into that law or the changes to the current process being approved or being voted for, these three aspects would represent a major friction. And I'm assuming that, the amount of people that would actually take that journey would be much, much lower than in the last election, which, if I'm not mistaken, anywhere around 6,000 to 8,000 people from the United States took the opportunity and voted by mail. The other thing that I would at least question or put on the table as a huge question mark is also the logistics around organization of such a day or date at the Slovak embassy. Let's just assume that I'll take 3,000 members or 3,000 individuals of Slovak origin that are or Slovak nationality that are within our database. Let's just assume that half of them would decide to actually take that journey to the embassy on the day of the election and would be willing to cast a vote. The little that I know about Slovak embassy in DC, capacity-wise, this alone might represent a huge challenge. If it's only, if the day during which one can cast a vote would be just one day, which I'm assuming that's what that would be, handling 1,500 people coming to the Slovak embassy between 8 to 4 p.m. as a work day would alone be something that I'm not sure that that's possible to handle, or it wouldn't come without some major frictions. And those frictions could potentially mean that some people that would take the journey would not be allowed to vote or would not be enabled to vote, which that element alone in terms of constitutional law, etc., represents potentially a huge risk. Even in terms of some people saying, hey, it's my constitutional right, and I was not, or I was denied, and so I'm going to take the next steps. So, from the practical point of view, the proposed changes are literally creating major friction and major obstacles for us living in North America to exercise that right. You are muted, Norbert.
Indeed, I'm muted now. I think you can hear me. Thanks a lot, because it was also from another perspective, and especially in the States, we have very big diaspora there. I was just maybe wondering, because still, even under the current legislation, actually, the people, when they send the envelope to Slovakia, it must have been delivered to certain dates. And I don't know if you have any data to which extent, whether it was a high number of envelopes they were not actually counted at the end because they were delivered too late. Whether, in other words, actually Slovaks living in the States, they were aware that they need to send this envelope actually within some time limit.
I don't have the data, but I'm assuming that maybe Andrej Probst, who is to talk after me, might, because I saw some of the data that he will share, so he might have some data. I don't have any data, but I will say this: when I personally participated in it, actually I will give kudos. I will give a positive feedback to whoever was setting up that process back then. I was very clearly informed when and how to get where to go to download, what sort of a identity proofs I will need in order to get the actual ballots. And then there was plenty of information on, giving us information about also time buffers in the accompanying kind of an instruction letter. So I thought that the process was well organized. I felt well informed, and I believe that I also have received a confirmation upon wherever that envelope went to. I can't remember if it was Ministry of Foreign Affairs or something else, but if I recall correctly, I have also received confirmation your envelope has been received. I think there was a barcode or something on it. So I mean, that's one of the things that kind of surprises me, if you will. Now I understand the element of potential fraud and the argument behind it. But with the current technological advancements and with all of them, a lot of these things are moving into digital identities, et cetera, et cetera. I think that we should be actually discussing about how do we use the current tech in order to improve the process to prevent the fraud, instead of changing the process altogether to something that United States alone has absentee ballots. My wife is American, so I know actually how that works, and she has took part. Prior to United States, we lived in Southeast Asia. She took part in local as well as presidential elections using absentee ballot. Very similar kind of a process that is currently still valid for Slovakia and voting abroad. So I think that the debate is a little bit shifted to somewhere where we should potentially be discussing how can we enable Slovaks abroad. And the other element that I keep on debating in my head is the fact that I live or many of my colleagues or many of my friends from Slovak Pro, yes, we are living in the United States longer term, but there is plenty of our members or plenty of people that are under the umbrella of Slovak Pro that are, for example, students on an exchange program for 1 year. And I mean university students, right? So they are 18 plus and they have the ability to vote. So I think that's the other element that I think that needs to be discussed is that I feel that sometimes the debate is being focused too much on those people that, and I've heard some, I've had some, how should I put this, opinion exchanges with some people in Slovakia. And they were saying, well, it should be based on residency. But there's, many people that have residency in Slovakia that are, a 2-week business trip that falls into the time slot when the elections happen, or, they are on a 6-month study program, or they are being assigned within their company to a one-year work program abroad, and they return back. And those types of assignments, or those types of Slovaks abroad, I think that the currently proposed changes are impacting even more.
Thanks a lot, Brano. I think your contribution here in this public debate, not only for this conference, was very important, because if it happens and the law will be passed in Slovakia, it will have, especially for the Slovak community in the States or in general in America, very huge impact, considering the low density of embassies, or I don't know, maybe they are also now discussing the general consulates. You might vote there, but I think there are just one or very few in the North America. So that's why I think for people who live there on the other side of Atlantic, it's really important. Thanks a lot once again, Brano. We'll be also happy with you to discuss later if you have some questions in our chat. Thank you.
Will do. Thank you.
And as I mentioned, we have actually 3 speakers for the third panel. And the next one is Miss Klára Deketova. And her presentation will be about elections in Denmark, where she lives anyway. But before I give the floor finally to Klára, I would like also to say something about her, because she's a co-founder and chair of the Slovak Danish network. You might remember that actually I mentioned this organization in the beginning as one of the participating organizations for this event. And this Slovak Danish network is actually youth-driven association that provides a platform for connecting Slovaks in Denmark. The association has become an important meeting point for people interested in maintaining and building meaningful connections between Slovakia and Denmark, particularly following the closure, which is also quite devastating, I guess, but we will hear more from Klára, that the Slovak embassy in Denmark was actually closed. In addition, Klára has been involved in several initiatives focused on youth empowerment and supporting Slovakia from abroad, including serving as an Aspen Institute Central Europe Young Aspen Leader. After completing her studies at Copenhagen Business School, she now works as a public affairs advisor at a Danish company. So this was very short introduction of very interesting story of Klára. And as I said, now we are going to listen Klára Deketova. Klára, please, floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Norbert, and also thanks to all the previous speakers and everybody who's listening. So as we just heard, my role here today is to talk about the practical consequences for Slovaks living abroad should they be required to vote at embassies. And more specifically, since I am a Slovak citizen living in Denmark, I will talk about Slovaks in Denmark as well as the broader Scandinavian region. And I will also very briefly mention the practical impact on students studying in Denmark should this legislation pass. And finally, I will briefly touch upon the rules of voting in Denmark. So, as Norbert said, I think Scandinavia is a particularly useful case to discuss when it comes to the adverse consequences of this proposed voting change. And that is because in December 2024, the Slovak government decided to close 2 embassies in Scandinavia, specifically the Slovak embassy in Denmark and the Slovak embassy in Norway. As a result, only 2 Slovak embassies remain in Scandinavia, where the embassy of Stockholm and the embassy of the embassy in Stockholm and the embassy in Helsinki. And while the embassy in Helsinki covers Finland, the Slovak embassy in Stockholm now covers 5 countries because it covers Sweden, Denmark, Norway, Iceland, and Greenland. Therefore, this decision has significant consequences for Slovaks living in the Nordic region, and particularly relevant to this discussion, major implications for the proposed voting change. So how many people are we actually talking about? According to the Office for Slovaks Living Abroad, the Slovak population in Scandinavia is approximately 17,000 people. So there are approximately 4,000 Slovaks in Denmark, 600 in Iceland, 5,000 to 6,000 in Norway, and around 7,000 in Sweden. So, therefore, should the proposed legislation apply, Slovaks from all over Scandinavia will have to travel to Stockholm in order to vote in person. And as Branjo just mentioned before me, I think some administrative considerations should also be considered here, because it can be quite a logistical nightmare. But if we are zooming at Denmark in this particular case, and looking at what would it practically mean for Slovaks to travel from Denmark to Stockholm, we are looking at least 1 full day of traveling. So for Slovaks living and traveling from the biggest Danish towns, they can either take a flight or a train. And while the train options might be slightly more affordable, the shortest one-way journey from Copenhagen to Stockholm takes 6 hours, while Slovaks who live in more distant parts of Denmark will have to take a trip of at least 10 hours by train one way. Traveling by train transport can cost from 200 to 500 euros one way. And while flight options are of course shorter, they are often more expensive. And depending on flight schedules and transport connections, voting will very likely require taking off work or university for at least 1 full day and paying for flights, trains, accommodations. And I believe the costs at really the minimum would be at least 400 euros. And I think very likely ranging to 1,000 euros for the whole trip. So who will be most impacted by this measure? If we are looking at the latest data from the latest elections, which I believe Andrej in the panel next after me will talk about, majority of Slovaks voting from abroad actually have a permanent residence in Slovakia. That means that most of the Slovaks that will be targeted or will be targeted by the law, by the legislative change, are living abroad probably temporarily. So here we are actually looking at students and young professionals. And as we know, Slovakia has one of the highest brain drains namely it is the second highest brain drain in OECD countries. There are nearly 20% of all Slovak university students who are studying abroad. And if we are looking at Denmark, so if there are around 4,000 Slovaks in Denmark, almost 40% of them are students. So in Denmark, this is actually quite a sizable part of the Slovak diaspora. And Denmark is a very attractive location for Slovaks to study because there is tuition-free education, while at the same time, there is a scheme of government scholarship grants, which really makes it possible for most of Slovaks who have to be self-sufficient to study in Denmark and take care of themselves, because typically they would work next to their studies while also having the government grants. However, if you as an EU citizen want to get this government grant, you actually have to work. And you have to work 10 to 12 hours per week. And failure to meet these requirements can result in students losing their grants or even being required to repay them later. As a result, traveling abroad to vote is not simply a logistical inconvenience in Denmark. Students often cannot freely choose their days off because they work part-time jobs in retail, hospitality, or other service industries. And missing a weekend shift may mean losing essential income or simply jeopardizing their student grants. And therefore, I think that students here are placed in an especially difficult position because they would not only have to pay for transportation to Stockholm in order to exercise their right to vote, but they also risk losing wage or simply having financial instability. And to make it a bit more personal, that is actually also my personal story because I am one of those Slovaks that decided to study abroad. I did my bachelor's and master's education in Denmark. And throughout my studies, I always had at least one student job. So either one or two. And especially at the beginning, I worked at the service industry. So I worked as a sales assistant in a clothing store. And these schedules, these working schedules, are often very inflexible. And weekend work is kind of mandatory. You just have to be there. So for me personally, there was quite a few family celebrations that I simply could not attend. And sometimes it was very difficult to get home for Christmas because there were shifts that I had to take in order to keep my government grant and the wage. Therefore, for students in similar situations, and therefore students in Denmark, traveling internationally to vote may simply not be realistic. It really is a cost that does not only involve the time and the money for the transport, but it's also potentially risking a bigger picture financial stability. And lastly, I would briefly want to mention a few things about the Danish model of voting. So Denmark has a fairly flexible voting system because there is advanced voting before the actual voting date, which can take place both in Denmark and abroad. So there is a possibility of advanced voting in Denmark, and this typically takes place from 6 weeks prior to the election day until 3 working days before the actual election day. And in this case, Danish citizens from all over Denmark can vote in citizen service centers, in libraries, in hospitals, nursing homes, even prisons. And to vote, to participate in this type of election, they don't need to give any kind of reason. This is accessible to everyone, and it's actually fairly popular. I would say that quite a few of my friends or colleagues are using this opportunity if they're, for example, traveling on the actual election day, or they simply want to avoid queues on the election day. And secondly, there's also possibility to vote abroad. So this is primarily meant for Danes who live abroad temporarily, and they are either abroad for vacation, education, work, or whatever it may be. And they also have a possibility to vote. The voting is physical. It takes place at either an embassy or consulate. But Denmark has around 500 locations all around the world where their citizens can vote in advance. And when we are looking at the timeline, it's also not on the actual voting day, that it's from up to 3 months before the actual voting day until 1 day before the election day. So if we're looking at Denmark, Denmark has a fairly flexible voting system that really makes it possible for people to participate, even if they are not in the country on the day of elections or they're simply busy.
Thanks a lot, Clara, as well. It was also very worth contribution for our discussion, especially because you come from Denmark. And as you already mentioned, if I'm not wrong, there is one of the largest students communities of Slovaks, not only in Europe, but actually worldwide. And very often in this discussion, and it was also mentioned during this conference, it's always said that the reason why this postal voting should be somehow restricted is the fact that those people don't live and they don't have very direct ties with homeland. But in fact, it's also very important to mention now that we have a lot of students who are there just for a certain period of time, but they might go back to Slovakia and live there, and actually their experience from Denmark or from whatever country bring back to Slovakia, which would definitely help advancing the country itself. Thanks a lot, Clara. I would love to allow you to answer any questions, but we are running a bit out of time. But perhaps we'll have a bit time at the end of this conference. And I would move last but not least to Andrej Probst with his presentation called Lessons from the 2023 Parliamentary Election Abroad, Slovakia and Czech Republic. But before I give the floor to Andrej, I would like also to introduce this distinguished guest of our conference. Andrej is our fellow countryman living in Prague, home to the largest Slovak diaspora. Andrej, through the portal or website Krajan.sk, which maps, informs, and connects the global Slovak diaspora, both traditional and new communities abroad, with one another and with the Slovak Republic. He carries out this work voluntarily, helping strengthen the ties between Slovaks around the world and their homeland. So this is also very briefly about Andrej. And indeed, Andrej, we are more than happy to hear also your inputs on this topic.
Yeah, thank you very much for invitation. And at the beginning, I need to thank to my predecessors because they mentioned almost everything that I wanted to say. I will say it again, but supported with some numbers. And if I may ask, I'm the only one who has the presentation. Oh, okay, it's there. Perfect. Nice. So at the beginning, I will not share with you my personal story. I will try to present some numbers or figures I received from the Ministry of Interior of the Slovak Republic after the last parliamentary elections in 2023. So what I did, basically, I asked for the numbers and let's say addresses, but when I say addresses, I mean only country and city because I keep the privacy from where, sorry, not from, but to where the voters asked to send the ballot and from what city in Slovakia. That was also interesting because, and you will see it already on the first presentation or on the first slide, most of the voters have permanent residence in Slovakia. That was quite a surprise to me. And what does it mean? So those people, they were born in Slovakia, they studied primary school, high school, and in some point of time, some of them, they went abroad to study. Some of them went abroad because of some job, work experience, anything. But let's keep it in mind that from the 72,589 people who asked for postal voting, 89% of them have permanent residency in Slovakia. So we might say, okay, so if so many people have permanent residence in Slovakia, so why do they want to vote from abroad? This is a very fair question, but the reality is a little bit different. This, sorry, the 64,000 people, as I said, they are mostly students, workers, and they went abroad and they kept the permanent residence in Slovakia from maybe I will mention three main reasons. So one of them, if you want to do anything, you need to have at least one permanent residence. And to get a new residency in abroad, it's not so easy. So therefore, it's easier for you to keep the residency in Slovakia because you already have it. The second point is, and maybe it's more important or the most important, it's some kind of uncertainty whether you want to return next year, in 2 years, or in 5 years, or maybe never. So it's the bond or relationship or tie with Slovakia is so strong that you keep it, but you are not decided whether you stay abroad, maybe you change the country, or when you will return back. And of course, because you were born in Slovakia, you have family members, friends, a lot of relatives in Slovakia, you still keep or would like to keep the relationship with them, and also through the permanent residency. Here, it's a very brief table with the countries where most people asked for voting. And as you can see, the country with the highest number of voters is obviously Czech Republic. And for me, it was surprisingly, it's more than 1/3 of the voters came from Czech Republic. The second is United Kingdom. And then Germany, Austria, Switzerland, I call them German-speaking countries, Netherlands, United States, and so on. So here you can see the top 20 countries, but there are more. And yeah, I'm just looking for Denmark because Denmark was mentioned, and Denmark is on the 10th. So we had 1,325 voters from Denmark, for example, from United States, 2,258. I mentioned these two countries by purpose. You will see it on the next page. So my predecessors already mentioned that there are some countries where there is no embassy of Slovak Republic. And the proposed law calculates that in one country there will be only one place or even none place where the people could vote. And in countries like Denmark, Norway, Luxembourg, Iceland, New Zealand, where there is no Slovak embassy, you cannot vote there. You need to travel abroad. Yeah? So, and you can see the numbers, how many people will be impacted by the new law if it is approved. So for those people, as we heard before, it will cost some money, time, energy to vote if they want to vote. This is also very important. I think Branjo already mentioned. Now the law calculates that there will be, let's say, one voting room or one voting place for around 1,000 voters. If it's like that, so imagine Czech Republic. In Czech Republic, we have around 27,000 voters, or we had in 2023. So next year we will see maybe a little bit more. That would mean that we will need 27 voting rooms. I was on our embassy in Prague. It's a nice building. It has several rooms, but I'm sure that there is not so many, like 27 rooms. And it is calculated also for one voting place, 3 people, administrators will be needed. So in the case of Prague, it would be 81 people. And I'm sure that there are not so many people. So the proposed idea, I'm sure that our people will change the law because this will not work in the reality. 27 rooms in Prague, in Czech Republic, will not be possible. So I'm sure that they will need to open more places, not only on embassy, but also on other places, and maybe not only in Prague, but also Brno, Ostrava, we will see. Yeah. And Branjo already mentioned also the case of United States, East Coast, West Coast. Again, one country, one place. So in case of United States, Washington, D.C. Is the place where the embassy of Slovak Republic is located. If you are on the West Coast, okay, then you will need to travel several thousands of kilometers. But imagine that we have voters also on Hawaii, not only on the West Coast or East Coast. And people from Hawaii, it's much more. It's more than 7,000 kilometers. And we have also voters, I was surprised, also on Mariana Islands. Okay, of course, for those people, it's better to travel to Japan. It's closer than to travel half the globe to Washington, D.C. So the idea of one voting place in one country, especially large countries, will not work in reality. So here's very simple conclusion, and I think it was also mentioned several times. The best would be the combination of preserving postal voting as we have now, or maybe I would prefer to some improvements, and to expand it on physical voting. I like the model of Czech Republic. So what they did in postal voting is that you need to send the ballot not to Prague, to Czech Republic, but you send it to the embassy. This is it has an advantage in matter of speed and cost and everything. In case Branjo asked the question, and I do not have the numbers right now, but I have it somewhere in my computer, how many envelopes were lost or delivered later than it was supposed to be. And this is not low number. It was, I'm not sure if hundreds or thousands. So there are several quite significant number of votes that didn't arrive on time or didn't arrive at all. And to change the process of sending the emails not to Bratislava, to one place on the globe, but to several places, to embassies, will increase the number of received the envelopes. So just conclusion, let's combine both systems in person on embassies, and we already know that embassy is not enough, so we will need more places, and postal voting. And I think this is the last slide. I think the law probably will be approved soon, and the postal voting will be cancelled and replaced by in-person voting on embassies. So this is like the challenge to us, to Slovak diaspora. Let's turn this threat into an opportunity, because our government or our parliament forces us to go during one day to one place. So let's meet together, maybe organize some happenings, get to know each other, build relationships. So we can use that time for strengthening Slovak diaspora. So this would be my ask and challenge for all of us. And that's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Andrej. Thank you, Andrej, as well. It was also a very worth presentation, because from your perspective, actually, you provided a lot of data, which is also important for this discussion. Also, maybe later when we want to bring and also maybe discuss with legislators in Slovakia about this law amendment. Perhaps I know that we are almost at the end of our conference, but I see a lot of questions, and perhaps I would like to ask you one of these questions here, which was even mentioned twice in the chat. It comes from Adela Klepáková, and considering the number of Slovaks who live in Czech Republic, was certainly the biggest community compared even to the others in Europe or on a world scale. I may be wondering if you could maybe just say very briefly here, whether do you think that actually the Slovak government recognizes the economic and civic contribution of its diaspora in Prague, but also in the Czech Republic as a whole, when discussing this change of postal voting? So maybe if you could maybe say from your perspective, if you think that there was any discussion with you. We all know the legislators in Slovakia are aware that we have a lot of Slovaks in the Czech Republic.
I don't want to talk instead of them, because I do not know how they think. I'm just what I realize that the interest of our representatives about Slovak diaspora is very formative or very formal. It's just if they travel abroad, okay, they find some time to meet diaspora, but it's rather formal. It's not on the, let's say, working basis that we would discuss our needs, our challenges. So I'm not sure if they are aware of the power of diaspora. What was mentioned with my predecessors, it was discussing about like the relationship between taxes and voting, like who pays taxes, that person should vote, who doesn't pay taxes should not vote. Or fortunately, it's not happening in any country, but the power or economic power of diaspora is not in taxes. Of course, we live in abroad. We do not pay taxes in Slovakia, but what we do, we send money, and it's called remittances, from abroad to Slovakia to support our families, to support the organizations in Slovakia. And in my case, I also support startups or companies in Slovakia. So this is the economic power of diaspora, not the taxes, but the money they send to, let's say, friends, family, friends, and companies, organizations. And this, I think, our representatives are not aware enough.
Thank you, Andrei, also for this very comprehensive reply. We are coming slowly to the end of this conference, but first of all, I would like to express my big thanks to all our speakers. We have had actually 7 speakers here today, and just let me please mention once again Mr. Andrei Zoll, Ms. Emma de Souza from Ireland. Mr. Andrei Zoll is actually from Poland. Then we also had Mr. Peter Spach from the Czech Republic, Ms. Daniela Vintila from Belgium, also Mr. Braňo Vargic from the United States of America, Ms. Klara Deketova from Denmark, and also last minutes we were listening Mr. Andrej Probst from Slovakia, but at the same time from the Czech Republic. Also, I would like to express my big thanks to all organizers that I mentioned in the beginning of our conference called Voice Beyond Borders. And I can also tell you that, of course, we will sum up all ideas from this conference, and we would like to further discuss with the legislators in Slovakia about the upcoming change, which seems to really happen. And I just try to sum up very shortly some inputs from this conference that were mentioned by our speakers during the last 2 hours. So first of all, we should consider this as a fundamental human right. The right to vote is a basic political participation right. Democratic rights conferred by citizenship should not depend on a person's physical location. Then also achieving universal suffrage. A democracy is only considered full when all its eligible citizens are involved, regardless of where they live. Also maintaining personal ties. Slovaks abroad often have family and dependents still living in their home country, and therefore care deeply about the quality of public services and governance there. Also worth mentioning state protection. The home state remains the ultimate source of protection for its citizens worldwide, justifying their say in who leads the state. Also global impact of policy, because domestic policies often have international consequences. For instance, immigration laws or foreign policy that directly affect the daily lives of citizens living in other countries. And also, last but not least, reflecting a globalized world. In a world where people move more frequently for work or study, external voting ensures that their right is actually heard and they are sufficiently represented in the legislative body. I hope that I haven't forgotten anything, but also I would like to mention that please don't worry, we are aware of all the questions which were raised in the chat on YouTube live stream. We will discuss these questions further with our speakers, and we will provide you answers to these questions as soon as possible. Then also I would like to mention by this occasion that you might see later, you will see before the end of this conference also a link, and by clicking on this link you might fill out actually the online form, and if you fill out this online form you will receive a press release which will be published actually in next days, and also full conference record which will be also published on the conference website, which is also mentioned in these presentations. So thank you once again, and ladies and gentlemen, we have reached the end of this conference, and I would like also to express my big thanks to all of you, because it was quite numerous. I've seen a lot of participants, a lot of questions in the chat, and we will stay for sure in touch, because it's the topic I guess it touches many of us who live now in abroad. So I wish you a wonderful evening, and I hope to see you soon at any conference organized by the new Diaspora. Have a nice evening. Goodbye.